Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the Slav Geller Gambit. Now it starts out in the Slav Defense, so d4, d5, and then after the Queen's Gambit, the most popular opening in chess was c4, Black plays the Slav with c6. Now play typically continues with knight f3, knight f6, and then knight c3. Black has quite a few options, but in this particular video, we're going to be looking at the accepted line, taking the pawn on c4. Now, there's lots of different ways for white to respond. The main line is to play a4, stopping the pawn coming to b5, or playing, e3 instead, just solidifying the pawn chain, preparing for the bishop to come to c4. Again, it could be protected if black wants to play b5, but then eventually trying to get this material back. But in the Geller Gambit, says, you know what? We're going to try something a little bit different. If we're giving up that pawn to material, we're not going to focus on it right away. Instead, we're going to try to control the center of the board and really put our opponent to the test. And that is with the move e4. Now, black almost always is going to hold on to this material c4. That's what they were going to do anyway. So especially if we're playing e4, they're usually going to play b5. Now, the best move from white is to play bishop e2, and this is what we're going to be looking at today. The variations from black that we may see in this, one could be g6, preparing to fianchetto the bishop to g7, castle on the king side. That's one option. We're also going to be looking at b4, just pushing on the queen side of the board, attacking this knight, trying to put white to the test. And then we're also going to be looking at bishop to b7, saying, you know what, let's hone in on this light square diagonal. Whites went ahead and played this e4, but what if black counterattacks on the center light squares? What happens then? So those are the three options. First option we are going to look at is this pawn to g6. Now, as soon as they play this, I like to be extremely aggressive. Yes, you could castle on the king side if you wanted to, but we already see that their queen side of the board is pretty weak as far as the pawn structure. Black's not going to be castling on the queen side anytime soon. And so when we see g6 here, white can be pretty aggressive. They already have control of the center with the two pawns here on d4 and e4. And I like to push forward with h4. Once we play h4, we've already said we're not as interested in castling on the king side. We absolutely could castle if we wanted to, but this says we don't necessarily have to. So just keep that in mind because it'll come up later in the video on why this is different than another variation that we look at. Now, how could they continue? One, they could just keep playing bishop g7, say, I don't really care too much about this pawn on h4. Or they could say, you know what? Okay, if you're going to attack on the king side, I'm going to attack on the queen side with b4. So let's look at the first option, and that is bishop g7. I think this is the worst of the two options because we're just going to continue to push and attack. We can start with e5. We always have this e5 move after we've played e4 in lots of the variations we're going to look at. Maybe they play knight d5. This just gets the knight out of the way for us to play the move h5. Now let's say they castle on the king side. We can take on g6. If they take, now all of a sudden we can push on the queen side of the board, and this pawn is protecting the pawn on c4. We can eventually take with our bishop. You can also see because the pawn on the f-file for black is gone, if we ever get our bishop to c4 and control this long light square diagonal here, that's going to put our opponent under a lot of pressure. So that's just something to keep in mind as far as why we're playing a4. We've already put pressure on the king side of the board, and we still have the semi-open file with our rook on h1. So we're just going to be continuously putting pressure on our opponent. And yes, they do have their rook on the semi-open file on the f-file, but typically when you do that, you want to have your pawns on g7 and h7. It's not very secure if you can see the king. All of a sudden, there's a lot of air in front of it. The pawn on g6 is already pushed up, so this is not a safe king by any means. Now, if we come back and say, what if they don't play bishop to g7? What if instead, or after they play, after we play h4, they decide to play b4? Okay, well now we can push forward with e5, attacking the knights. If they want to exchange, because they definitely have that option, we're fine with that. We could take on f6. If they want to take on b2, we can take bishop on b2. They could take our pawn and we can recapture with our bishop on c4. Now, the reason I said earlier is we may not care about castling is they could play bishop b4 in this spot. And that's fine with us because we could play king f1. Our rook on h1 is not trapped. Instead, we can just keep pushing forward, protecting it with this rook. It can easily get involved into the game. King to f1 is completely fine with us. That's going to be different than the next variation that we'll look at here in a minute, but that's why white is completely okay. They have the bishop on b2 and c4, eyeing down on the king side of the board. You can see that from black's standpoint, their pawn structures aren't great on the queen side. They have an isolated pawn on c6 here. They can castle on the king side if they want to, but white just has so much material they can throw at them. So it's going to be very difficult for black to hold on to the position. The next variation we're going to look at, instead of playing g6, they could play b4, attacking our knight. Now, we could always play a4, but this is not the approach we want to take, in my opinion. We want to be fairly aggressive, keep things in the center of the board, and always be attacking. Bring our knight to a4. This knight's pretty much out of the game here, and we also don't want to just move the same piece over and over if we eventually get it to c5 at some point. Not really the strategy I like to go. Instead, we have the move e5. This is also what Magnus Carlsen played at a major tournament where he dominated, so I feel like if it's good enough for him, it should be good enough for us as well. So e5 puts a lot of pressure on our opponent. Yes, they're attacking our knight, so they could go ahead and take. We're going to capture, and they have some options here. They could go ahead and take down here on b2. We can just recapture with our bishop. And then if they take our pawn, we can castle on the king side. The reason we castle on the king side, if you say, well, why don't we just take this pawn on c4? If we take, this is a little bit different than the instance that we looked at previously where our pawn was on h4. In this position, we actually don't mind castling on the king side. That would be the best approach to get our rook on h1 involved into the game. But now they can play bishop b4. Now we're in a tough spot because now we play king to f1. And we don't really just want to play h4 now because the king side of the board for black isn't as weak. And so this is not as good of a position. And so instead of taking on c4, which we could do eventually, I think castling on the king side first makes a ton of sense. Now, they may decide, you know what, I don't want to take here on b2 because that just gives them an opportunity to recapture and get their dark square bishop involved into the game. A lot of players don't like to do that. So instead, they could just take with their pawn on f6. If that's the case, we're just going to take with our pawn, and they could play queen to a5. Remember, we haven't castled yet. This pins down our pawn to the king, but we can still just castle, and this is a trap, and the reason I like to go ahead and castle here, because if they take with their queen on c3, this would be a huge mistake. Now, the reason it's a mistake is because white has the move bishop d2, and we're able to really put a ton of pressure on our opponent. A few things you'll notice. One is the queen right now is fairly trapped. There's only two squares that they can go to. You have b2 and can come to a3. But also you can see the king is still exposed here in the center of the board, and that's going to come into play as well. Black also doesn't have other material that's developed that can help in this game. So from here, I think black's going to play queen to a3, probably the best way to get the king or the queen out of harm's way. But now we can start gobbling up material. Yes, they capture that pawn on c3, but now we can start capturing with more threats than our opponent has. So bishop takes on c4, attacking the pawn on f7. And this pawn right now is only defended by the king. Also, this opens up for our rook to come to e1, putting more pressure on our opponent. Really, black needs to be thinking about how they can get their king to safety. So maybe bishop e7, blocking off any attack if we come to e1, which we are going to play. We're going to play rook to e1. And they could castle on the king side. Now we're going to play rook e3. This attacks the queen. So the queen needs to come up to, d6. I'm showing the best moves from black. They don't have to. They could completely fall apart, and then we just easily take more of their material. But now we can play queen e1. really attacking this bishop on e7. So how do they respond from here? Well, they have two options. One, they can play rook to e8, which is a huge mistake, trying to control it, or they could play bishop to d8. So let's look at both of those options. The first one being the huge mistake. It looks logical. Yes, you have your rook here defending the bishop and the queen, but now we have the move bishop b4, attacking the queen right here. It's defended by our own queen here on e1. So what do they really do? You know, they could give up material if they wanted to, but at the end of the day, they're going to need to move their queen. Yes, the queen is still defending, but we have an additional defender now on this e7 square. So we're going to win the exchange because we've added that bishop to the mix. So even if we exchange right here, you can see we are now up in the minor piece game, and it should be a pretty easy in game for us. Now, if we come back, instead of playing rook to e8, which I think is a huge mistake, they could just play bishop d8. Now, you can start to see that black is being in defensive mode. They're just bringing their bishops back to the 8th rank. They're not involved into the game at all. And this is going to be difficult for them to play extremely well. They're just going to be defending, and they're in a tough spot, especially because we still have the move bishop b4, attacking this queen, pinning it down to the rook. Definitely needs to move the queen, and we can just take, after they take here, we can play queen c3, and they are in a tough spot. We can get our other rook involved into the game. We're controlling the center of the board. They don't have a lot of good options. So really depends on where they move with their queen, but if they take that pawn on c3, they're in for a world of hurt. The last option we are going to look at is, instead of playing pawn to b4, attacking our knight, what if they play bishop to b7, trying to control this light square diagonal after we played our move pawn e4. From here, we're going to stay pretty aggressive and play e5. And then after knight to d5, we have the tricky move e6. Now, this is somewhat of a trap because if they take, that would be a huge mistake. But even if they don't take, they're in a tough spot. So first, let's look at what happens if they take. We can play knight to g5. This opens up a lot. One, because they've moved the pawn from the f7 square, we can now play bishop to h5 at some point, attacking the king. But we're also attacking the pawn on e6. So how do they defend that? Because right now we have one attacker. It's kind of awkward if they move their bishop back to c8. Now they've moved it to b7, moved it back just to defend it, and they have a weakened king side. They're not going to be able to castle on the king side anytime soon because the bishop on f8 is pretty blocked off. They can't move their e7 pawn easily. So that's kind of a tough spot. And then from here, we can start pushing on the queen side, putting max pressure on our opponent. So that's not very good. If they do something else, maybe queen to d7. Okay, well now we can just play bishop g4, getting more material involved, attacking the pawn on e6. Now they have no real good way to defend this unless they want to bring their bishop back here. But even still, we can take because they can't take with their leading queen here. We could take it with our knight. So we can still get more material involved, and they just don't have a good way to defend this. So that would be a terrible option. But if they don't take on e6, really the best move for them, because we're coming in hot. We are playing pawn takes on f7 check, and then they're in a world of hurt. So really they need to, in this position, play f6. But as soon as they play f6, this still opens up. At some point, we have the threat of the bishop coming to h5. So just keep that in mind. First, we're going to play a4, attacking this pawn. If they play b4, which makes logical sense, we're attacking, and then they want to continue to attack and not just lose this pawn right here on b5, because then we can start to chip away at the structure on the queen side. But we have the tricky move now on knight to h4. They may think, why are you just giving up this knight here? But again, we're always trying to look for ways to put our opponent in a tough spot where if they don't know the position, they can make a big mistake. And if they take here, we have that opening that we talked about, and that is the bishop to h5. Now, the only option then they have in this spot is to play g6. But now we just take with our knight. And they can't just take with their pawn, because if they do, that's going to be checkmate. So that would be a huge mistake, obviously. You can see this pawn on e6 is doing so much work here. So really, if you look at the options that they have, bishop g7 makes some sense. Okay, but now we have the move queen c2, and this puts him in a tough spot. Now, if they were to play, let's say, rook to g8, because the rook's under attack, this actually falls, and this would be checkmate. Anytime we move our knights, it's going to be a discovered attack, so maybe knight h4. This is check with our bishop. Now, how do they respond? Remember, we have our queen that can easily come into the game. Maybe they try to play king f8. Remember, they're in check here. Okay, well, now we take with our queen on h7. Maybe they play knight f4. Doesn't really matter. We're going to come up here, knight to g6, check. They could take, yes, but we take with our queen, and how do they stop the checkmate from coming? They absolutely can't. So rook to g8, again, there's a few other variations that black could try to make it last one or two moves later, but at the end of the day, they are going to lose. If they don't play rook to g8, though, how else do they respond? Maybe f5, trying to block the queen from getting into the game. But the queen just takes. Okay, maybe that opens up the door for the knight to come to f6. Does that help? Well, no, it doesn't, because now we can just take with their knight on h8, and they can't recapture because, remember, as soon as the knight moves, it's a check. It's discovered attack from the bishop on h5. They're in a ton of pain, and so they maybe play king to f8, get out of check. Knight to f7. This is a pretty difficult outpost for them to deal with. Yes, we're attacking their queen, and they can come down, capture on d4, but after we castle, they don't have a lot of threats here. Their rook on a1 isn't doing much. Their knight on b8, and even their bishop on b7, it's going to take some time for them to get involved into the game. This bishop on g7 hit fianchettoed here and eventually wanted to do something. It's not doing anything at all. And so you can see from White's standpoint, we have a pretty good game here. We can get our dark square bishop involved into the game. We can get both of our rooks involved, trying to control the center if we want to. But this is the power of the Geller Gambit against the Slav, is it really puts our opponent in some tough spots. So that is the Slav Geller Gambit. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you play the Queen's Gambit and you play against the Slav, I definitely think you should check this out. So thank you guys so much for watching the video. I'll see you guys next time.